Okay, hello everyone. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me, first of all. It's Mary Collier with the Ontario Museum Association. So can you just indicate in the chat whether you can hear me or not? Excellent. I suppose if you couldn't hear me, you wouldn't be able to say in the chat. So that's good to see. All right. So I am very happy to welcome everyone to our third webinar in our winter series, this one on strategic planning. And we're very pleased to partner with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport to present this Learning Lab Winter Series focused on supporting museums with the Ministry's standards for community museums in Ontario. So at the OMA, we've been working with the Ministry to provide resources related to the standards at our website, and you can get to the CMOG Standards Resources page from our homepage at museumsontario.com. If you haven't checked back lately, the recordings and the slide decks from our last two webinars are now available on that page. So if you weren't able to attend the last two in the past couple of Thursdays, that's where you can access those. But we're particularly pleased that this partnership with the Ministry has allowed us to present this Learning Lab Winter series of webinars focused on the governance and finance standards specifically. The OMA has planned these webinars with subject matter experts to provide information on best practice, but also to provide you a venue to connect with your museum and heritage advisors from the Ministry to answer questions specific to the standards themselves. So our next webinar in our series, we're taking a couple weeks off, but then on April the 4th is a webinar on museum and fundraising ethics. So registration for that is now open, and you can get to that at our website as well, museumsontario.com. And also, just keep an eye out this spring and summer for some other webinars and workshops related to the other nerds. So we're really excited that over 100 people have registered for today's webinar, and we've got over 50 signed in so far, so that's a really fantastic turnout. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows how to participate if you haven't been to one of these before. And first of all, I should let you know that we are going to be sending you the slides that you can see by email this afternoon, so you don't have to worry about being able to write everything down real quick. So you can see the slides and hear the presenters like myself speak. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, simply type your message into the chat box at the bottom of your screen and click send. If you don't want everybody to see your question, you can send it privately to the presenters by using the Send To drop-down menu and selecting All Presenters. So I'm going to be monitoring the chat, and we'll do our best to ensure that all of your questions are answered. But if there's anything that we don't get to in this webinar, please identify it in your evaluation so that we can follow up. We do only have an hour and 15 minutes today, and we want to get in as much as we can. As you can see in the agenda, after this introduction, I'm going to pass the mic over to John Linton, who's our webinar presenter today. Some of you who were here last week will recognize that name. Please feel free to ask him any questions about the content of the webinar during his presentation. But following his presentation, there's going to be a 15-minute Q&A with Kathy Blackburn from the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport, and she'll be able to answer questions about the governance standard itself. So I'm just going to introduce our presenter. John Linton is a management consultant with TCI Management Consultants in Toronto. He's undertaken numerous projects in the arts, cultural, recreation, and entertainment sectors, including strategic and business planning, audience research and development, membership surveys, pricing strategies, feasibility studies, public policy development, social and economic impact assessments, and program evaluations. John was formerly a director of the Ernst & Young's Hospitality, Tourism and Recreation Group in Canada. And in over 20 years of consulting experience, John has conducted work for a broad range of clients, including the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Royal Ontario Museum, the Ontario Science Centre, the Metro Toronto Zoo, the Vancouver Art Gallery, the Canadian Federation of Friends of Museums, and the Ontario Museum Association. So I am going to let John take over from here.
And I think I'm on. Am I on? Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen out there in Radioland. Welcome back to many of you who were at last week's session that dealt with mission and vision as a kind of prelude to a strategic plan. And welcome to those new who are joining the session today. It's particularly gratifying that so many of you signed up for this session during the March break time, so very gratified and glad to see that. Today's session, as Mary was saying, is on strategic planning, and as I was mentioning last week, we talked about the formation of vision and mission statements as a kind of first step or a prelude to the overall development of a strategic plan. This week, today's session, we're going to focus more on the details of the strat plan after the vision and mission have been developed and structured. We're going to follow the same format that we did the last time in terms of 10 frequently asked questions that focus on various aspects of strategic planning in a museum context. And just to give you a bit of a heads-up agenda as to what those FAQs are, here they are. The first 5 are as follows. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the sort of why bother with a strat plan in the first place anyway. What are the benefits of a plan? And does a museum really need a strategic plan? You probably all have guessed by now that the answer to that question will be yes, but nonetheless we'll pose it and and answer it. Secondly, what are the areas that are typically covered in a strategic plan for a museum? A museum, of course, is a sort of unique operation, unique kind of entity in society, does some things different from other businesses and other not-for-profit groups, so we want to look at some of the areas typically covered in a strat plan for a museum. A question that has come up frequently is how far ahead should the strat plan look and how often should it be revised and updated, so we'll deal with that. Another frequently asked question is what's the difference between a strat plan and a business plan? We hear these two terms, sometimes they're used interchangeably. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key differences there. And then on this theme of differences, another aspect involved typically in a strat plan is goals and objectives. What are the differences there? So we'll address that. So those are the first 5 questions. Then we move on to questions of measurement and evaluation. How important is it? What sorts of things might be looked at? And then sort of returning to a bit more of a top-line focus, what are the characteristics of a good plan versus a bad plan or a not-so-good plan once all is said and done? And what is the process for developing a strategic plan? Particularly, do we need consultants? And the answer, surprisingly, is not always yes. I should reveal to those of you who don't know, I am a consultant, and I, in part, make my bread and butter doing this kind of thing, but you may not and don't always need to use a consultant. Question number 9. What's the role of the board? Very key and critical role in developing and endorsing a plan, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, once the plan is developed, how do we implement it? How do we start using the plan to affect our day-to-day lives? So those are the 10 FAQs. You will probably have other questions that arise as we go, and as Mary was saying, she'll be moderating those and feeding me selected ones. So let's get right into the first question, which is what are the benefits of having a well-articulated strategic plan? By well-articulated, I simply mean one that covers all the bases and is sort of well thought out, and we'll talk about some of the dimensions of that. And does a museum really need a strat plan? So the answer, of course, is yes, and without question. It's always a good exercise and a very useful exercise to go through a strategic planning process. You always learn things that you didn't know before. There are always surprising new insights and directions that emerge from that kind of a process. So unequivocally, the answer is yes, you should go through this process. And for 2 reasons, really, in my view. One is not only is the result actually having the strat plan which guides you on a day-to-day basis in terms of fundamental decision making, not only is that result useful, having the plan itself, but also secondarily or actually equally important, I guess, is the process of going through a plan, and we'll talk a moment about that. First of all, the result, just having the plan articulated, developed, thought through, down on paper, is a useful thing to have, both internally from the point of view of the board, staff, key stakeholders and volunteers and so forth, so that everybody understands and agrees on what the mission, the vision of the museum is, and how these are going to be achieved over time in terms of the strategic action areas and the specific actions that have been developed. And it provides guidance on how resources are to be allocated. At the end of the day, the strategic plans are useful because you don't always have unlimited resources in terms of staff time or funding or volunteers or whatever. So you need to make sometimes hard choices about how to utilize those resources. So a strat plan can be immensely helpful in guiding those sorts of decisions about resource allocation. Secondly, the result of having the plan itself is very useful externally. It shows your funders, your key stakeholders, the general public, that you have got your act together, that you know where you want to go and why, and you've got the directions outlined that will help you get there. So it's a very useful thing not only for your internal audiences, but externally to show the outside world that you know what you're doing and all about. So that's the result of having the plan itself, but equally importantly is the process through which you get there, through which you develop the plan. As we'll discuss in a moment, typically the process is going to involve multiple groups in a sort of ongoing conversation about the future of the museum, what you're all about, and this sort of goes back to what we talked about last week in terms of identifying and defining vision and mission. So what you're all about as an organization, and what your future is and how you intend to get there. And it involves many of the organizations and groups that are critical to your future in that discussion. So the board gets involved, staff, typically volunteers, members, politicians, other stakeholders in the community, and even reaching out to the general public in many cases. So you get people aware that you are going through this process of defining and deciding upon your future, and it gets people energized, charged up, enthusiastic, and so forth about participating in that kind of conversation. We talked about this a little bit last week in terms of the development of vision and mission, but I see the whole strat planning process as, in a sense, the ultimate team building exercise, that you really do get everyone involved, and it can be a very energizing, exciting process for those people who are involved. So let's turn to our second question. Why isn't this advancing the slide? There we go. Sorry, I guess I am on a Macintosh system, and this is a ThinkPad, so it's a bit cumbersome for me to use, so apologies about that. So let's talk a little bit about the areas that are typically covered in the strategic plan for a museum operation. There are, in a sense, sort of three parts to this. First of all is the structure of the plan itself. Secondly is the strategic action areas that are typically involved in a museum operation. And then third are the operational action areas that are of concern to any kind of business or any kind of enterprise in society. First, let's talk just about the structure. A typical strategic plan has a fairly common structure where you start with the articulation of vision, mission. Often you have a sort of supplementary statement of values that provides some context through which the vision and the mission can be understood. And we talked a lot about that, of course, last week. That vision and mission gives rise to specific strategic action areas. Some are functional in terms of the unique things that museums do, and we'll talk about that, and some are operational in terms of the things that any sort of business or organization needs to be mindful of. Those strategic action areas in turn lead to goals and objectives, which then give rise to specific actions. And then for actions, we think in terms of implementation. Who's going to be doing them? When are they going to happen? And so forth. And then what sort of evaluation do we want to put in place to make sure that we are actually hitting the marks, meeting the milestones, and so forth. So that tends to be the structure of a typical strategic plan. And here's a little tip at the bottom of the slide there. I often, in fact, really always, try to develop a plan that is can be summarized on one sheet of paper, so that it shows the logical interrelationship and interdependencies of the various components to the plan. We've got an example here, which is the strat plan of your very organization here, the Ontario Museum Association. Mary, I'm having difficulty getting this slide. Okay, thank you. I don't know what's going on there. So here is, and sorry, it's a bit fuzzy and maybe indecipherable here, but you can see the full plan if you like on the OMA website. But here's a one-page summary of the OMA's strat plan. So it shows on the left, the column there, the kind of essential fundamentals in which the plan is grounded. So at the top we've got the vision, that sort of future notion of where the organization wants to be. The mission in the middle, a sort of day-to-day operating mandate of the organization, what it's going to be doing. And then at the bottom, the statement of values, that is the sort of context in which the vision and the mission needs to be understood. So those are sort of the key fundamentals in that column on the left. Then in the middle, we have the strategic action areas, and you can see there that 5 specific areas of activity that have been earmarked as being the essential things that the OMA wants to accomplish and wants to provide service to its members within. And then in each of those strategic action areas, you can see on the right, there are specific actions that have been outlined. And I think the one, I can't even see what's on my screen, but I think the ones in green are maybe the higher priority things, or the ones that need to be accomplished in the first year. So you can see there's a lot of information captured on the page there. It sort of does summarize all of the essential components of the strat plan. Doesn't get into all the implementation details, but that's downstream. This kind of summarizes where the organization wants to go and how it wants to get there. This is, in a sense, the summary roadmap. So it's useful just to kind of capture the content in a summary form. But beyond that, it does convey the idea and kind of shows that the plan itself is a logical, interrelated whole, that the component pieces all fit together, they flow out of one another, they relate in a logical and kind of tight way. So it's a very, again, going back to the use of the plan for external audiences and your funders and stakeholders and so forth. Something like this is a great way, I found, to kind of show that you really have your act together. Here's the plan, and it's presented in an understandable and summary format. So that's a little bit on the structure of the plan itself. Typically, in terms of the areas that are covered by a strat plan, the first thing we think about are the kind of strategic action areas that are, in a sense, unique to a museum operation. These are the fundamental aspects of what a museum is all about in society. So, of course, you would be concerned about collections and what you do with that collection in terms of curatorial activities, research, and so forth. Exhibitions and programming being another sort of common key area. Looking at the visitor experience and sort of what sorts of takeaway messages and education and so forth do visitors get who are coming to your museum. Membership development, marketing promotion, outreach. These are some of the typical functional areas of museum operations that are, in a sense, unique to a museum, and you wouldn't see these in a retail operation or any kind of other business enterprise. So they are essential in terms of thinking through where you want to be and what you need to do in each of these areas as a museum to accomplish your mission, ultimately, to get to where you want to be and to operate according to your mission on a day-to-day basis. In addition, recognizing that any museum is, in a sense, a business enterprise or a not-for-profit organization, there are other things that you need to be mindful of just in terms of how you run yourself as an organization or as a business. And so these typically involve things like human resources, volunteer recruitment, financial partnership development, what you want to do in terms of your physical plan, and so forth. These areas may or may not be part of a strat plan, and I guess it really depends on your particular situation in terms of how important some of these things are in ultimately realizing the opportunities that are available to you and again ultimately accomplishing your vision. When we do strategic planning work, we don't necessarily incorporate all of these in the strat plan itself, but depending again on the circumstances, some of them may require so much change that they become strategic in terms of where you need to go as an organization. So that's another aspect that needs to be thought through in terms of the areas typically covered by a strategic plan. Okay, our third question, frequently asked question, is sort of how far ahead should a strat plan look, and how frequently or how often do we need to update and revise it? We have found that sort of typically 3 to 5 5 years is a good planning horizon to think of in terms of a strategic plan. It's not too long, too distant in the future, and yet it's not too short a period of time in which to think. So that's typically a good window to think of in terms of where you want to be at some point in the future. But within that, any strategic plan should be reviewed and possibly revised and updated on an annual basis. You want to each year at a minimum, and probably kind of on an ongoing basis, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, you should kind of check your strategic plan. How are you doing on it? Is it still relevant? And in most cases, the answer to that, if you've sort of done your homework and thought through the plan correctly in the first place, the answer will be yes, we're on target, this is still appropriate, we still want to adhere to our mission and accomplish our vision and so forth. So a lot of those will be the same, but nonetheless it should be sort of continually revised, reviewed, and if required, revised. Remember at the end of the day that any strategic plan really aims at a moving target. We live in a constantly changing society. There are always unforeseen circumstances that arise, new opportunities that emerge, contingencies that need to be taken into account. Somebody gets run over by a bus. There are always these sorts of things. So you should always be mindful that you need to kind of look at your strategic plan on an ongoing basis and revise it if appropriate. Now, another question that we hear a lot of is sort of what is the difference between a strategic plan and a business plan? Are these just two interchangeable terms, or is there a bit of a difference? Well, certainly we've seen that in many cases these terms are sort of used a bit interchangeably. But if sort of pressed for a specific definition to kind of differentiate between the two, I think that typically strategic plan is longer term, and it kind of outlines the general intent of the organization to meet ultimately that vision that we talked about a fair bit last week. Business plans tend to be shorter term, usually sort of the next fiscal year or the next couple of fiscal years, and often they're focused on demonstrating a return on investment for a specific initiative or a new enterprise or building a new wing or whatever it may be. Often the business plan piece is kind of what's put in place to justify that area of activity in a return on investment process. Business plans tend to be different from the annual budgeting process, which tends to deal, of course, with expected revenues and expenditures on a year-to-year basis. But business plans don't tend to be as long-term as strategic plans. So that's a bit on sort of the difference between those two concepts. Fundamentally, and often they are used interchangeably, but there is a difference, I think, in terms of the intent and the structure of these sorts of things. Typically, strategic plans are much more inclusive in terms of involving a wide variety of people, getting everyone's view on what that vision and mission should be and the strategic action areas and so forth. Business plans may be done by staff, often senior management staff, to demonstrate to the board the return on investment of a particular area of activity. Another type of difference or question that we see relating to terminology is the difference between goals and objectives. And another kind of related question on that is how important are they in a strategic plan? So I guess first of all, just the difference between the two is perhaps in a sense one of degree to some extent. But typically goals tend to be broader statements of intent and indications of where the organization wants to be in certain areas, whereas objectives are narrow and more precise than goals tend to be. Goals often are sort of intangible and somewhat non-measurable in nature, qualitative rather than quantitative, whereas objectives tend to be tangible and specific. Goals often being abstract while objectives are concrete. Let me give you a couple of examples. So here's a possibility in terms of goals and objectives for a museum strat plan. A goal might be to develop the audience and build membership. membership. So fairly general statement of intent, makes a lot of sense. Often in terms of a strategic plan for an organization, you want to build up your audience and make sure that you have a constituency in place for the future and all those good things. But nonetheless, the goal is sort of a generalized statement of intent. The objectives on the right here are much more specific, and you might say, for example, we want to increase attendance by 10% to whatever thousand by year 3 of our strategic plan. Or we want to build a membership base to 1,000 individuals or families by year 2. Something like that. Something that's measurable, precise, and tangible, and you can actually measure against that whether you have achieved that objective or not in the subsequent implementation and evaluation of the strategic plan. Another example, I won't go through each of the things here, but to ensure the collection is properly stored and cataloged. Again, a generalized statement of intent, quite appropriate for a museum strat plan. And then in the objectives, you can see several specific areas in which that objective might be measured and kind of acted upon. Well, getting to that question about measurement and evaluation, another common question is, how important is measurement and evaluation in a strategic plan? And I guess my thinking on this is, well, why bother with doing a strategic plan in the first place if you're not going to use it as a guide, if you're not going to check on ongoing progress and determine whether or not you're actually achieving what you set out to achieve? So to my mind, it's integral. It's kind of the other side of the coin, or whatever. It's an essential part of developing a strategic plan, without which the whole development of the plan is sort of meaningless. It sort of follows from that really the purpose of evaluation is to determine first what's working well, what's on track, where are we making the progress that we thought we might make or we're hoping we would make, and then secondly, where have we gone off the rails, and if so, why have we gone off the rails, and what needs to be done about it. Let's make a mid-course correction, and let's change what we need to change. Bear in mind, I was talking earlier about the need for a strategic plan to be a kind of evolving, changing, ongoing process where you're constantly checking progress. Well, here it is right here. Have we gone off the rails? If so, why? And what do we need to do about it? And then finally, some of the specific initiatives, projects, ideas that were embedded in the strategic plan will have been accomplished as you go through the process of implementing the plan. So what have we completed successfully, and what's the next challenge that we face? What's the next related goal and objective and so forth that we need to think about in our plan? Again, kind of points out the importance of that ongoing evaluation and monitoring of the plan, and changing of the plan where it needs to be changed. I guess the last point I want to make here is that, well, I've talked about the importance of measurement and evaluation. I advise you not to be obsessive about it. I've seen some institutions that spend a lot of staff resources, a lot of volunteer time in the measurement process, to perhaps the detriment of maybe doing other things that are useful in terms of accomplishing the plan. There are many occasions, I think, when sort of just some sense of consensus from senior management and the board may be enough to determine whether something's on track, without necessarily having gone through a survey of the membership to determine whether it's exactly 80% that agree with something which might have been articulated in an objective in the strat plan at the outset. So measurement is important, it's useful, but don't spend an undue amount of time on it if there is a general sense of on the part of the board and senior staff that you are accomplishing what you set out to accomplish. In last week's session, I talked about how a plan is as much an art as a science, and again, I sort of reiterate that here, that there is the science of measuring objectives and accomplishment of goals and so forth, and there's the art and the sort of qualitative evaluation of sort of knowing when things are on track and when you're accomplishing what you set out to accomplish, and the two are a bit in balance, and that's of course ultimately the role of the board and the senior management team in getting the organization there, and we'll talk a little later about some of those aspects. So to return for a moment just to the sort of top line analysis of sort of what are the characteristics of a good strategic plan and a bad strategic plan. This is a bit of a summary chart that attempts to kind of paint some of those key dimensions and probably overly starkly represent the good side and the bad side, the bad end of the spectrum. Um, so I guess the first row there just looks at the way in which the plan is developed. And typically a good plan will be developed by a group of stakeholders involving the internal audiences or the internal groups, the board, senior staff, perhaps the volunteers, and external stakeholders, which may be politicians in a municipal context, maybe they're the representatives of the Friends group, maybe they're key funders, maybe they're key users who may be teachers or the tourism industry for packaging and this sort of thing. But a good plan typically involves the solicitation and the utilization of input from a wide variety of stakeholders who all have a vested interest in some way, shape, or form in the museum and its performance in society. On the other end of that spectrum would be a bad plan that would be just developed by a few insiders, maybe just a couple of board members or the director and one or two of his cronies, his or her cronies, that doesn't have that sort of buy-in and the kind of sense of shared vision and shared enterprise that you get from having a plan developed with a wider group. And so that's, I think, a key dimension in terms of separating a good plan, in a sense, from a bad plan. Remember, I was talking earlier about the process of developing a plan and it being, in a sense, the ultimate team-building exercise. I think this first line gets at that. A second thing is that the plan should, and I guess the way I think of this is that a good plan is sort of kick-started by an inspiring, visionary statement of vision and mission, and as opposed to a not so good plan that kind of starts with a bureaucratic sort of flat statement that doesn't excite anybody and doesn't really impress anybody. I came across actually just a couple of days ago a mission statement for a private sector organization. So we're not talking about a museum here necessarily, but it said something like that our mission was to deliver value-added services to our customers across multiple platforms. So I would submit that as an example of a bad mission statement. It's hard to imagine somebody leaping out of bed in the morning saying, "Oh boy, I'm going to today deliver value-added services to my customers, and not only that, I get to do it across multiple platforms." It just sort of falls flat. And last week we talked about and showed you some examples of some of the more visionary and exciting, engaging vision and mission statements in museums and other cultural institutions. So I'd encourage those of you who maybe weren't part of last week's session to maybe look at the webinar and see some of those. So anyway, to get back to the point here, I think that a good plan has this kind of kickstart that is an exciting, inspirational vision and mission that people buy into, want to get behind, want to be part of. The next dimension is a good plan, I think, is seen to be an integrated whole, an overall logical narrative, going back to that sort of one-page summary I was talking about, that you can see that the parts flow from the whole, that it is a logically interrelated set of activities, as opposed to a bad plan, which would perhaps be perceived as kind of a set of random activities, things that aren't necessarily related. A bad plan in that regard, I think, raises questions as to, well, why are we doing this, and how does this relate to that? Whereas a good plan, it's almost self-evident because it's obvious how these things are related to one another. A good plan is written simply, is easy to understand. A bad plan is jargon-ridden, complex, difficult to follow, and again, raises more questions than it answers. Again, sort of on the good spectrum, a good plan, I think, is recognized by certainly the board, the management, and probably all of the stakeholders to be an ongoing process, to be sort of not carved in stone and set aside, but rather an evolving, living, breathing process that guides the organization on an ongoing basis. The bad end of the spectrum is that a bad plan is just seen to be a document and something that probably goes on a shelf. Mary, help me here. Something's popped up on my window here and obscuring the slide. The second last thing just talks about how a good plan is updated and refined annually. This is kind of part of the previous point, thanks. That it's an active, ongoing, living initiative. A bad plan is typically done and shelved, and nothing in the organization changes. And finally, not to belabor this too much, but a good plan has a detailed implementation plan with targets and dates. So it's not just the plan is done and then people sort of brush their hands and walk away, but it again affects the organization on an ongoing basis because there's specific targets, dates, actions identified, whereas a bad plan or less well done plan typically does not have those aspects. The next question, we're getting near the end here. Question number 8 is, what is the process for developing a strategic plan? And particularly, do we need consultants? We hear that a lot. So I'm going to talk about a number of aspects in the development of plan. First of all is the strategic planning team. So we talked before about the desirability of involving more than just one or two people, but a larger group, and really taking advantage of the opportunity to develop a plan to engage a wider variety of constituents. So some things to think of here are first of all, the need to create a team to undertake the necessary consultation and decision making that would be required in the plan itself. That team should represent the key constituencies of the organization. By key constituencies, I mean the people whose involvement is essential. So the board, the management, key staff need to be represented in the development of a plan. They're the ones who know the organization, the museum, most intimately, and their input and their involvement is critical. But in addition, there should be reps from other stakeholder groups, key users, as I was saying before, who may be teachers, maybe the tourism industry, maybe researchers, volunteers who have a real vested interest and sense of the organization. Many volunteers feel that they are equally a part of the organization as our staff, and they're in some senses part of their lives are tied up with the organization. That needs to be respected and listened to and incorporated in a strat planning process. Members, the same thing. Key users, I talked about. So other stakeholders can be and should be involved in the overall strategic planning process. I find that a group of maybe 5 to 8 people is just about ideal. If you have too many more than that, it starts to get sometimes bogged down with too many people and trying to herd cats together. And if you have many fewer than 5, that it starts maybe be a little less representative of the various stakeholder groups that it could be. So 5 to 8 people, good, manageable, workable group to incorporate all of the key perspectives that need to be incorporated. And another little tip, it's useful if one or more of the people on your team has had some experience with going through a strategic planning process. That experience can be very useful in providing advice about how to do things and to just understand the overall process. All of you, of course, now that we've been through this webinar and last week's session as well, will be pretty familiar with the structure of a plan and what needs to be incorporated, but nonetheless it's useful to have somebody else who's been through the process as an advisor. So that's a little bit about the team that you might want to think of incorporating to help develop a strat plan. The process itself, once you've got your team together, what are the sort of the processes through which you work? I think there are basically 3 phases to the work, and of course, again, depending upon your specific situation and time frame and so forth, maybe you have 4 phases, but these are, I think, the essential things that need to be done, whether you sort of structure them as 3 discrete phases or somehow you've got them splayed out over other types of tasks and activities. Nonetheless, at the end of the day, these are I think the 3 things that need to be done. First of all, you need to collect data and analyze or assess your current situation. Secondly, based on that, you need to develop your strategy. And then third, once you've got the strategy, you need to kind of think of the implementation, how you're actually going to achieve the strategy. So I'll talk a little about each of those 3 phases or aspects, types of activity. The data collection and situation analysis piece typically involves consultation and assessment. So the consultation would involve talking to your board, your staff, your volunteers, your funders, users. You probably all know who the people are in the community that you need to talk to get some input. It will help guide the plan. I'd also suggest that often it's useful to talk to people who are not users, or people who do not have a high regard for the museum, perhaps. Maybe there are some naysayers in your community. You want to find out what their particular issues are, and whether there are any aspects in which the strategic planning process might address those concerns and issues. So talk to a wide variety of people is kind of a useful thing. Sometimes you might want to do a survey of visitors, or maybe even the general community, the general public, to get some sense of awareness and utilization and areas where they think the museum should be going. Often it's useful as well in the data collection to do some best practices and sort of benchmarking with other institutions that are in similar circumstances. And of course the OMA, I think, provides a great vehicle through which you can connect with one another and pull some of that information together. After collecting all this information, you want to go through a sort of situation analysis process where you kind of look at what all this information is actually telling you. I find it useful to go through what we call a SWOT assessment, looking at your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. There are other formulations of pulling data together, but this is one that I think is useful from a strategic planning point of view. The identification of strengths and weaknesses are typically things that are affecting you right today, your current strengths, your current weaknesses, and then looking a little more to the future, what lies out there on the horizon in terms of opportunities that you might capitalize upon, and what are some of the threats facing you. I think a SWOT assessment is a useful basis for a strategic plan, because your strengths you want to protect, you want to enshrine, you want to capitalize on them. Your weaknesses you want to overcome, you want to look at sort of what do we need to put in place to shore up or address this area of weakness that we've identified. Opportunities, you want to do sort of feasibility assessments, or perhaps business. This is where business plans might come into play, to look at new areas of business, new opportunities, and whether or not they make sense for your museum or your institution. And then similarly, threats, you want to identify what is the risk that may be lying out there, what sort of contingency plans might we put in place, how might we address these threats if they come to pass in future. So all of this is fodder for the strategic planning process, and indicates directions and potential actions that need to be thought of in your strat plan. At the end of the process, it really identifies what your strategic options might be in addressing strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So phase one, data collection, situation analysis, talk to a whole lot of people, get the information, and then figure out what it means through a situation analysis, SWOT assessment kind of thing. Then you move into phase two, where you actually develop the strategy. So based on what you learned collectively through your SWOT, and I say collectively, bearing in mind that you are a group of 5 to 8 people, you've got different perspectives, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts in terms of your discussions and so forth. Based on your SWOT assessment, you then sort of go through the development of vision, mission, statement of values, and the strategic action areas and goals and objectives in the way that we were talking about before. Again, thinking how these logically relate to one another and respond to what you've identified in the SWOT assessment. And then this brings you to the third phase, which is once the strategy is articulated and developed, how do you implement it? And so there are a number of things to think of in this area, basically coming down to sort of the time frame in which you want to do things, who's going to be responsible for the various actions, and resource requirements. So again, this is just some kind of tips that I have found useful in the development of strategic plans when we've been involved. Time frame, it's often useful to think of what do you need to do immediately versus kind of short term, and typically a year, or depending on the particular time of year, it may be sort of tied to a calendar year. Like if I was doing a strategic plan today, I'd probably think in terms of short term being to the end of 2013, or maybe the end of the fiscal year of the organization. Anyway, so typically short term time period would be about a year, and then a medium term maybe 2 to 3 years out, and a longer term 4 or 5 years and beyond. Again, bear in mind what we talked about earlier about the time frame for the strat plan being typically 3 to 5 year periods. So this would kind of mirror that logic. A second area to think of in the implementation plan are the responsibilities for the various actions that have been indicated. So we think here of, what should the board be doing, what should key staff be doing, what should other organizations be doing. Sometimes the friends group or volunteers might be responsible for certain actions. And beyond that, I also like to think in terms of sort of who is primarily responsible, who is in a sense on the hook to make sure that that particular thing gets done, who is going to be a support resource to help whoever's on the hook to get it done, and then who may be available on an advisory or a participatory basis to kind of help out with the overall initiative. So anyway, it's a good thing to think through for each of the actions you've identified, who is actually going to deliver on that action. Another area, of course, is resource requirements. We can't do everything that we might want to do. There are limitations to human effort and financial involvement and sometimes physical resources. So think through what are the resource requirements that need to be allocated to undertaking these specific actions. You may recall earlier I was talking about how part of the use of a strategic plan is to guide resource allocation. So resources, human, financial, physical, we need to think through what are those resource allocations going to be to deliver on the strategic plan. And then evaluation. What do we need to measure? When do we want to see these things happen? And how are we going to undertake the whole evaluation process? And then the final thing to talk about under the theme or the question of what is the process for developing a strategic plan is, do we need consultants? We often hear that question, and I guess the short answer is no. You don't always need a consultant. I think, in fact, the best situation for any museum, any organization that's going through a strat planning process is, in fact, when they can do it themselves, assuming they do it properly. Consultants can be useful on some occasions when either you just don't have the time to do it yourself, everyone is strapped, you're running hard doing the good things you do, so you just don't have the time to devote to it. Sometimes consultants are useful in that regard. Sometimes you perhaps need some objectivity or distance or sort of dispassionate advice, particularly if there are contentious issues and there's a real dichotomy maybe on the board or between the board and staff. Sometimes you need that sort of dispassionate, objective advice in terms of how to move forward. So that may be a situation. Sometimes if absolutely nobody on your team, the sort of 5 to 8 people you've been able to pull together, has any clue about how to do a strat plan or any previous experience, maybe that's a reason to call in somebody. Again, all of you now have got some familiarity with it as a result of these webinars, and of course the OMA is available to provide further assistance. But anyway, that may be a reason why you want to get a consultant or somebody else involved. Sometimes it's useful to bring someone who can bring experience from related situations to the table. So somebody who may have done a strat plan in a similar organization or a similar circumstance or facing a similar opportunity, sometimes that's useful to incorporate that expertise or that advice into your overall process. And sometimes you may need professional facilitation experience. So there may be these reasons in which you need to bring in a consultant to help guide you through part or all of the process. And if you do use a facilitator, there are a number out there who have not only facilitation experience, but also some content experience in terms of doing facilitation work in a cultural institution or even a museum context. And I'd suggest that that may be valuable to think about. Not that they will do your plan for you or think through the directions for you, but just that they can provide some thinking and some advice about what's happened in other situations, things that you might want to think about when you go through your own plan. Getting near the end here. Question number 9, what is the role of the board in creating and endorsing a strategic plan? First of all, I'd say that board members should be involved in the process of the creation of the plan itself. That, in many respects, is their role. One of their fundamental roles in life is to guide the organization and determine where it needs to be in future. So they need to be and should be involved in the process. when the strat plan is developed, they should endorse it, endorse the directions, endorse the vision, the mission, and the various activities of the organization to get there. They should be involved in the annual evaluation of the plan, and of course any major revisions to the plan that result from the evaluation process may need to be endorsed and approved by the board, and so they would of course do that. And often there's a board committee that's sort of set up specifically for the purpose of minding, monitoring, so forth, the strategic plan, or sometimes known as the long-range plan or the long-term plan of the organization. So often a board committee can be useful in that context. Finally, how do we develop our plan once it has been developed? And just a couple of quick things to mention here. As mentioned just a moment ago, a board committee is a useful vehicle through which the implementation of the plan can be monitored and guided. We often see that an implementation team from the staff involving senior management staff is also useful. That sort of they have an eye to the overall implementation plan, and somebody's sort of in charge of making sure that things get checked off and undertaken. And in some cases, it's useful to perhaps have an advisor committee that may be made up of representatives from some of the external stakeholder groups. So maybe your friends, maybe your volunteers, maybe your members, maybe key users, maybe the general public. Again, not to determine the direction of the plan or the evaluation or implementation, but rather just to provide some ongoing advice to management and to the board about that implementation. And I guess at the end of the day on this one, once you've developed your implementation plan, you've sort of gone through that thought process that I was talking about of, what's the actions, what's the time frame, what are the resources, what are the responsibilities. You need to follow that implementation plan. Again, there's no purpose in developing a strategic plan if you don't measure and evaluate. There's no purpose in developing an implementation plan if you're not going to follow it. So fairly straightforward and logical advice, I would suggest at that point. So that's question number 10. The last two slides just are a couple of things that I found particularly useful in working with organizations in the overall strat planning process. There are a few general resources. The mission statement book is a great collection of, I think, 300 and some odd mission statements, include some very good ones, some very bad ones, and it's a great and entertaining kind of resource. The second book, Strategic Planning for Not-for-Profit Organizations, is a great overview of, for any not-for-profit group, of the key steps involved, mirroring what I've just been talking about. And this last thing is a great resource. It's a bit dated now, but I find it very helpful in attaching policy to a strat plan and just talking about how you can develop policy for governance that is nested in and related back to your strat plan. So those are some general resources, and then a couple of key ones focused specifically on the museum community. I won't go through them here, but they're just listed there. You can see that they cover most aspects of developing a strat plan, from the overall development of mission, vision statements, all the way to the underlying strat plan itself. And I think that brings me, Mary, to the end of my slides, so be happy to open it up to any questions. There's a question here about the range of costs for a consultant. This is a variation on the question, how long is a piece of string, I think. So I do know that I and my colleagues, my firm and other firms, have been involved with museums on projects that range from either a pro bono a day or two here and there to a couple of days, which typically would cost a couple of $1,000s, all the way up to very intensive strategic plans for large federal government museum operations that cost in excess of $100,000. So it can be really as the range of costs can be as wide as the nature of the work required and the ability of the organization to afford to have work done for them. So and that may not be a very specific answer, but it really does depend on your situation, the way in which you want to get a consultant involved, the amount of time, and so forth. So it's a pretty wide open question. Yes, Tom has a question here. Many community museums are operated by municipalities and council serves as the board, and it is difficult, if not impossible, to engage them as strat plan. Any thoughts how to involve them in a meaningful way? Great question, Tom. Yeah, it is difficult. Whenever we're in this situation, we try to kind of cast the net wide to provide every council member with an opportunity for involvement, and in some cases are more successful than others. Often, unfortunately, a museum operation in a municipal context or regional context is seen as a lower priority item than municipal arenas or the current budget or whatever the thing may be, and so it tends to perhaps be given short shrift. I know we've worked with some organizations where we've gotten friends groups and other organizations, heritage and history related and so forth, to put some pressure on their local representative to get involved in the process. So that's one way. That's maybe not the most optimal in terms of giving them a chance to provide input. I think all our advice at the end of the day is that we've typically tried to involve them in a number of ways, either offer personal interviews or a questionnaire that they could fill out, or public meetings that they can show up at, and so providing multiple ways that they can provide that input is really all you can do on your end. If they just are do not see it as a priority and are not prepared to participate, they won't, and I agree that's unfortunate. And it is different, of course, from having a specific museum board whose job as a board is invested in the museum, and their purpose is to guide it in future, and they understand that. Council has so many responsibilities that they typically have a lot of apples in the air and aren't able to spend perhaps the time on this that they should. Another question here about should we include members of the general public at large on the strat plan team? I guess I'm not sure if the answer to this is always yes, but I think it's certainly something to think about. And I guess where I've seen that work well is where there are members in the general public who are real museum sort of aficionados. They understand the purpose and the role of a museum in society, and they want to get involved. Now, often those people are also your members or key volunteers or whatever, but not necessarily. So sometimes you'll sort of know who those people in the community may be, or they may be just sort of enlightened thinkers generally that you kind of think may be able to play a useful role in a strategic planning team for your museum. And often when you invite them, that's a real kind of feather in their cap, or a real honor to them to be thought of in that way, and they'll participate. So I would think it's always a question you should think of, and where there are people who want to get involved, they'll get involved. Another mechanism that I've seen in some cases is to advertise in the community. So you say, we are looking for members of the general public who want to be involved in the strategic planning process. We're looking for people to advise us, and people who are truly interested and want to participate will come forward, and you can get some good people that way. Yes, we have one more question here. You don't refer to the organization's mandate in the presentation. Is the statement of values referring to the mandate? Gail, the reason I didn't was we spent a fair bit of time last week talking about sort of the vision and mission and mandate, and the various forms of mission, which may be sort of seen as mandate or statement of purpose or so forth. So I wouldn't see the statement of values typically as the mandate or the mission or the statement of purpose in and of itself, but rather kind of the underlying context. Often their statement of values is great. I think it sort of outlines the kind of human values that the management team and the board bring to the organization, but typically they sort of tend to be a bit general, a bit motherhood-ish, dare I say. So I think they provide the sort of context for the much more specific and interesting and engaging mandate or mission or statement of purpose. And again, if you haven't seen last week's presentation, maybe you could go back to that, because I think we did talk about some of the differences in terminology and intent behind some of those statements. Oh, and I've been instructed to stop broadcasting and turn it over to Kathy. So here's Kathy.
Okay, it's Mary again. I just want to jump in and say thank you to John for that presentation. Once again, plenty for us to take in and think about, and that we can act on and share with other members of our organizations. So now, as John mentioned, I am going to pass it over to Kathy Blackburn. So Kathy is a Museum and Heritage Advisor with the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. So this is your opportunity at this point to ask questions specifically about the ministry's governance standard itself. So if you have any questions for Kathy, please type them into the chat, and I'm going to ask Kathy to start broadcasting.
Thank you for answering that question, Gordon. I've fallen into that acronym trap. I also wanted to tell Karen that I begged John to include a slide of herding cats, and he did not. Okay.
It's because I had my mic on the wrong way. I hope you can hear me now. And I hope Karen Matilla heard me about the herding cat slide. I wanted to answer the question that we had received about standards prior to the session first. So the question was, what is successful completion of a strategic plan as part of CMOG requirements? So that if you are required to submit a strategic plan, you are asked to provide an updated strategic plan related to mission statement and purpose with timelines and identification of who has primary responsibility for accomplishment of each strategic goal with timeline for achievement, which is the piece that John referred to as the implementation plan. So thanks for supporting that, John. One common feedback that we had provided was, and again, John touched on this very nicely, we had strategic plans that had ended in the year submitted and didn't identify who was responsible or deadlines, and no indication was provided of what was accomplished as a result of the 10-year plan. So I think oh, Kathleen is telling me my sound is garbled. I'm okay now? Okay. So that is a perfect example of a plan that would be in John's bad plan category. Karen had asked about grants for strategic plans. There are none provincially yet, but stay tuned. There may be one in future. There are no longer federal grants for strategic planning. And there may be, what you might want to check would be whether your municipality or historical society would fund that kind of capacity building initiative for an organization. So if you're looking for funding, if you Google funding and capacity building or board development, those kinds of things might get you something, but I'm not aware of an easy easy source for that question. Okay, we're still working on it. Okay. And I don't know if I had other questions there while we were. Okay, good. Then what the other thing that people are asking about, and this is only for people who have this as a requirement to submit a strategic plan to the ministry. And that is what we're looking for by April 30th, 2013, is the identification of who is participating in the process, a timeline of the process, for example, meetings with what has been and will be addressed with dates, and the approved mission statement or statement of purpose that you're going forward on. And then by October 31st, 2013, we would require the completed strategic plan, including timelines for accomplishment and who, staff, council, advisory committees, others responsible for accomplishing the strategic plan. I also wanted to, John mentioned this in his list of resources, but we had already provided you pieces of the Building Responsive Museums on the OMA's standards resources under governance and planning, and they include, one is about developing a mission statement, and it's page 8, titled Creating a Vision for Community Involvement. The next one to do with that phase, that first phase that John discussed about working on a strategic plan, critical thinking for effective self-assessment. And then a final one that talks about working together and how to work collaboratively. So those should be on there. Yeah, I actually had just moved it up because I thought maybe it was rubbing. Okay. Okay. So, anybody have other questions? Provincial Tourism Region. Oh, excellent. Thanks for that, Anne. Hooray. Two good sources. And I had already indicated some that don't cost money. That's right, Karina. It doesn't require the full strategic plan. It just requires identification of who's participating in the process, a timeline of the process, what's been done so far and what's to come, and dates, and the approved mission statement or statement of purpose. Sure, Stephanie. Yes, I didn't know if that was being typed after I repeated it or before I repeated it. Allison, did you hear it the second time? Okay, I'm going to repeat it one more time and hopefully I'm audible, but as Stephanie has asked to email the requirements, so I can, if other people email me, I can email it back to you. So by April 30th, identification of who is participating in the process, a timeline of the process, for example, meetings with what has been accomplished, or what will be addressed and the dates for all of those. That's the implementation plan part, and an approved mission statement or statement of purpose. No, John said, and he started with this last week as well, one does the mission statement, works on the mission statement prior to working on a strategic plan, because the mission statement is giving you the vision which the strategic plan is working to accomplish. Rebecca, could you email me, just because I'm just between the short walk between the OMA and our office, I don't want to forget you, but I'm happy to send them. I think we're good. Yes.
Well, hello again, everyone. It's Mary Collier again, and a big thank you to Kathy for her presentation, her participation today. And I want to again thank John Linton for his presentation, and the Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport for their support of this webinar series, and the ministry staff participation in the process. And thank you to all of you who signed in today and for your participation as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, the slides will be sent out to you shortly, along with a link to the webinar evaluation. So look for that this afternoon. We have been recording this webinar, and it'll be available on our website shortly. So if there are any other individuals in your organization who weren't able to be with us live, they can access this at a later date. As I also mentioned earlier, both of the previous webinar recordings are available on the CMOG standards section of the website, of our website. So, and I just want to also remind everyone of our next upcoming webinar is on museum and fundraising ethics. So that one is we're going to have a representative talking about the Canadian Museums Association's ethical guidelines, just kind of introducing what they are and what they're all about and why they're important. And then we have an individual from from Imagine Canada talking about their ethical code for fundraising and financial management. So ethics specific to the fundraising side of things. So those are both going to be incorporated into a single webinar on April the 4th, same time, 12 o'clock, and it's also a Thursday. So registration for that is open on our website, museumsontario.com. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.